Today, so I found out where I put it, there it is, we're dealing with the question of religion and politics. And it's divided into two segments. The first segment we will do now, and that is the relationship between religion and politics in the more general sense, the relationship between church and state, which takes very different forms both historically and geographically on this planet. A little bit of history. State religions were present right from the earliest days of organized society. But the idea of calling on the local god or gods or goddesses to protect the state and to achieve its ends was a very fundamental part of religion from the onset, and state organization as well. However, when the ancient Hebrews first came into Canaan, there was something else happening that was a little bit unusual. All the surrounding states had state religions. They had their own set of gods and goddesses, and the two states went to war, and one beat out the other one. It meant that their god had to be stronger than the other guy's god, and therefore that one was obviously the superior one. The Jews took a very different position on this. Initially, when Joshua supposedly came into the Holy Land and started taking over all these different cities, he was not a king. He was simply a war leader. The king was God. He received his orders from God. And in the Hebrew Bible, where you have the book of Judges, describes a period of time when you had individuals who were also not kings, but were leaders of various kinds. Sometimes they were war leaders, sometimes they were actually judges, sometimes they simply provided inspiration to the people. They were women as well as male judges during this period. But in all cases, there was not a king. They had explicitly rejected the idea of a human king. Unlike all the other states that were surrounding them, their king was God. Well, this lasted for some time, but many Hebrews were finally getting a little bit restless. After all, everybody else had a king, so maybe they should have a human king as well. Also, in order to protect the state, you needed a strong leader. You needed someone with solid authority who the people could accept and follow. So then you had the kingdom initially of Saul, followed by the kingdom of David and the kingdom of Solomon, and so forth. Now you had the period of the kings. But during this period of time, you also had a state religion, Judaism, in its early forms. And it was inconceivable that you could have a kingdom which was not also religious in some sense. Time went on. You had the Roman Empire with its various gods and goddesses. Sometimes the emperor would be selected, declared to be a king, usually after he died, but not necessarily always. And this is what got them into some difficulty with the early Hebrews, because the Hebrews had large numbers of individuals who were in scattered communities all over the Roman Empire, heavily engaged in trade and whatnot. And but they were exempted from the rule of emperor worship, because the Romans respected ancient theologies. They were quite tolerant in this regard. Christianity was a different story. Christianity was kind of a new guy on the block, and therefore regarded with suspicion by the Roman authorities. So when the early Christians in the Roman Empire decided that they did not wish to worship the emperor, they were regarded with suspicion as being both unpatriotic and atheistic, because they were not following the Roman pantheon of gods, and in particular, emperor worship. So they regarded all this with great suspicion. Time marches on. The advent of Christianity eventually produced a state of toleration. Now Christians could be tolerated within the Roman Empire. Later on, of course, in the time of Constantine, they became the established religion of the empire. And very rapidly after that, a very intolerant piece of history. All other religions became suspect and banned, in fact. Ancient temples were torn down, other religions were regarded as being heretical and had to be suppressed, and so you had the beginning of Christianity in the West. Interesting things that started to happen with the fall of the Roman Empire. Suddenly, there were no leaders that they could rely on, secular leaders they could rely on to uphold the authority of the church. So they cast around for someone to help take their place. They settled on Charlemagne, around 800 AD. He became a king, in fact an emperor, was declared a Holy Roman emperor by the Pope, and duly crowned, much to his surprise, I might add, and some chagrin. He wasn't expecting that to happen. He was visiting Rome on a courtesy visit, and the Pope decided they would crown him, thereby establishing papal authority over the king. That was an important development. Charlemagne, however, was strong, and the empire, the papacy was quite weak during this period. So Charlemagne took a major role in appointing bishops, establishing sees across the empire, and generally conducting quite a bit of work in terms of proselytizing, usually at the point of the sword, in the Germanic lands particularly. Conversion by the sword was quite a common practice back in those days. But the leadership, the virtual leadership, much of the leadership in terms of religious organization was Charlemagne's, not the Pope's. Gradually, as the papacy began to gain strength and began to establish itself in its own right, not because of its armies, but because of a different kind of power, which I'll get to in just a moment, you began to move into the Middle Ages proper, and now a different kind of set of problems began to arise. State, which is to say the king, versus Pope, over who had the right to do what. In particular, points of concern had to do with the appointment of bishops. Who had the right to appoint bishops? Who had the right to tax church lands? These were key questions because power resided in ownership of the land. And as the church and the monasteries began to acquire more and more land, which was bequeathed to them down through the centuries, they began to become a real temporal power in just about every country in Western Europe. This was often resented by the kings. They saw a decreasing tax base. They saw less of control over bishops, who by now could be temporal leaders as well as spiritual ones, because the see, the bishop's territory, controlled people, controlled land, controlled wealth, and could exert a great deal of temporal power. So there was this constant struggle between the Pope and the king, which often resulted in some kind of a compromise. Now the kings had a decided advantage. They controlled the armies, such as they were in those days. But the church had power as well. They had the power of excommunication. If they excommunicated the king, then it meant that no one had to obey the king. Furthermore, they had the power to withhold all sacraments from a particular nation until the king decided to cave in and follow the dictates of the Pope. These are very powerful tools that was in the church. So there's this constant struggle going on between church and state during this whole period. These struggles continued for so long as the church was a temporal power. Then you had the time of the Protestant Reformation. The time of the Protestant Reformation, something else started to happen. What you had here was a constant struggle between conflicting religious beliefs. And the result of which, after 30 years of warfare, which decimated the population of Germany in particular, you had the Treaty of Augsburg. The Treaty of Augsburg did not settle the relationship between church and state, but what it did do was to allow the temporal leader of any given area in Europe to decide for himself or herself what the state religion would be in their territory. Everyone in that territory was then expected to follow the religion of the king or duke or whoever was in charge of it, the prince. Which produced certain complications if the prince decided to convert to another faith. Everybody in the family had to convert with it. Now, for most ordinary people, this didn't matter much, since they were largely uneducated and were quite prepared to follow whatever was there, particularly if the new religion didn't look terribly different from the old religion. as in the case of Lutheranism, for example. So this was the development, so this was not a time of religious toleration at all. The Treaty of Augsburg did not establish religious toleration. But religious toleration was starting to come in a few little corners of Europe, one of which was in Transylvania. And most of you who are Unitarians will know the story of Transylvanian Unitarianism. I will not go into it for now in great detail, but just to say that the Treaty of Torda, the Edict of Torda in Transylvania, where the Transylvanian king established religious toleration for 4 religions: Catholicism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, which is called the Reformed Church, and Unitarianism. They were now all officially recognized as state religions. Now the king did this not for very good reasons. It was not because he was being terribly altruistic. It's because they were surrounded by Muslim territories. In order to prevent discord within his own country, and he was very concerned about that, would open the door for Muslim interference in the state. So to prevent that, it was necessary to establish toleration for at least some religious denominations. That was the beginning. So now we move on to something more like the present day. State religions today still exist. In societies such as the Nordic lands, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, you have state religions, which in all those instances, as well as northern Germany, are Lutheran. And part of the reason why this has taken so well there is because these countries are quite uniform. They're uniform culturally, uniform ethically, and uniform religiously. There's no great warfare within any of these countries when the Reformation moved into it. The changes were accepted quite readily, even at the level of bishops in many cases. And so there was no real controversy as these things came in. These religions are still state religions. Now, state religions may have several meanings, one of which is that simply to say, okay, fine, so we will expect that the leader of the religion, for example, might be, as in the case of England, might be the king or queen. That's the head of state. That's also the head of the Anglican religion. And the Prime Minister of England appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay? So a very close tie there. But other than that, people are perfectly free to express whatever religion they wish to have. So the restrictions are mostly, say, in the monarchy. The monarchs are expected to be Anglican. It would create a very awkward situation if they were not Anglican and yet head of the Anglican Church. So to prevent that kind of controversy, they must be Anglican. In the case of the religions in other Nordic countries, as well as in Germany, you have actual state support. Part of what you pay for your tax dollars goes to support, in this case, the Lutheran faith and organization. However, you can be exempted from that, but you have to apply. And if there's some other religion that you espouse, that you wish your tax money to go to, you can specify that. But the important thing is, you have to take the initiative, not to have your tax money go to the Lutheran Church. In southern Germany, which is mostly Catholic, we have a slightly different situation. They work out a different system, slightly different. That each state within the federal country of Germany can establish its own state religion. So in the south it would be Catholicism, in the north Lutheranism. Other countries took radically different positions. With the outbreak of the French Revolution, with a tremendous amount of apathy for the established Catholic Church, you had an extreme separation of church and state. Even after the revolution settled down, and even after the time of Napoleon, we no longer had an official state religion at all. In fact, France, along with Turkey until recently, taken the most extreme positions regarding the separation of church and state. For example, in France, you might be aware of the controversy over the wearing of religious garb. And same was the case in Turkey at the time when Ataturk took over. And so no religious garb should be publicly demonstrated. If you're a teacher, you cannot wear obvious religious symbols. But this does seem to be acceptable to the majority of the population. It's that extreme example of separation of church and state. Now, in North America, particularly in Canada and in the US, you have a different situation again. In these countries, you do not have a uniform population. You have a very mixed population. Mixed ethically, mixed in terms of country of origin, mixed in terms of religion, and so the idea of having a state religion simply was not a practical way to proceed. And very early on in U.S. history, the idea of a state religion was considered anathema. First in the colony of Virginia, which later became the state of Virginia. That's where it started. Thomas Jefferson wrote the necessary changes to the Virginia Constitution to prohibit the establishment of any one religion. That meant you could not have an established religion, okay, one formally recognized by the state. Even on the liberal Nordic model, no state religion. Okay, now that seems to be fairly clear, but putting this into practice has proven to be extremely challenging in both countries. You have all sorts of issues which churches have taken a particular position on, and the state may have taken a different position on. So issues such as compulsory military service, for example. Some on religious grounds argue that my religion does not allow me to participate in warfare. And in some cases this was recognized and accepted. The Shakers were particularly exempted from religious service by Abraham Lincoln, for example. In other cases, you must show that your religion has this formal position of not participating in warfare, in which case you might be exempted from the draft. And in some cases, there may be other kinds of service you'd be expected to perform, such as working in the ambulance services, for example, or some other social activity that you could perform in lieu of military service. So you have these provisions in there, but all of these are tended to find compromise positions. Other ones a bit more recent than that are abortion, gay marriages and the definition of marriage, the creationism versus evolution in the teaching of materials in schools, blood transfusions, and compulsory vaccinations, doctor-assisted death, which is still an issue here in many cases, that's still being worked on, so in a manner of speaking. Holiday celebrations, and particularly an issue in the States, can you have a creche on city property, for example. There are others as well, religiously required clothing. Remember the issue with the RCMP on the wearing of turbans by Sikhs? Well, Sikhs eventually got their way in that one. The hijab, and other use of ceremonial daggers by Sikh students in schools. All of these have been issues, and all of these have presented difficulties in trying to iron out what kinds of restrictions are reasonable for the state to perform, and what kinds they can be tolerant about in terms of allowing groups to go their own way. Compulsory sex education is another one. I can see some emerging issues which will be coming up, such as the notion of animal intelligence and therefore animal rights may become an issue that some religions may wish to take a stand on. Genetic engineering is another one. How far can that go? That's an ethical issue, generally speaking, but I believe that some religions may wish to take an official position on some of those issues as well. So there are many issues on which the relationships between church and state have been complicated and continue to be dealt with, often through compromise, give a little, take a little, but none of these have been easy to resolve. So what I want to do now is to stop talking. I want to open up the question as to your own thoughts on the relationship between church and state. Ought a church have an untraveled right to lobby for certain positions at a federal or provincial level, for example? There should be some restrictions on how much say they should have on decision making at the political level. We have limits in this country. For example, under the, I think it's the Societies Act, that church cannot spend more than 10% of its annual income on political issues. And under no conditions can they advocate for a particular political party or a particular politician running for office. That's a no-no. So that's just one example of a state-imposed limitation on what certain churches can do. It's okay to do charitable work, but argue for a change in official policy, there are certain restrictions that apply on Canadian churches, and we run into those ourselves. Okay, I'm going to stop talking on this for now. There's a second issue, which we'll get to a little bit later, on the whole question of individuals in terms of sort of depart your religion at the door. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Right now I want to deal with the more general issues. So your own thoughts on this. What are, in terms of our church, for example, what should be our position on these issues? How should the whole issue in general be dealt with between relationships between church and state? Anyway, I'll throw that out to you now, and over to you.
You reminded me of a friend of mine. I went all the way through school with him, and he did philosophy at UBC, which meant, and he had to teach elementary school. He couldn't get up to the high school level. And when he started teaching, he taught all of his career here in West Vancouver. And he had to read the Bible first thing in the morning or whatever it was. And because of his study of philosophy, he was very much of an agnostic. Eventually, he was uncomfortable doing this. And I don't know whether the students in the class had much opinion about it, but he stopped doing it on his own. And nothing ever happened. I don't know that the rest of the teaching staff or the principal took issue with him on that. But anyway, it just reminded me of this in what you were saying.
I had to deal with a similar issue myself, actually, as a college administrator, when one of our instructors who taught adult basic education, a very strong religious fundamentalist, very kind person, actually. I quite admire her work. But she really wanted to be able to teach creationism as an alternative to evolution in her class, and I told her, no, I can't do that. That evolution is the accepted curriculum in our science program, and you have to stick with that. So that was a tricky one to deal with, but that's all these things do come up. Someone else.
My understanding is that religion is fading in many areas of the world, so I find it interesting that Northern Europe has Lutheranism, for example, as a common theme, and yet most places in Europe, I understand people are fading away from religion. But the one place I read was that the one area of the world that was increasing, other than the Muslims, of course, is in the United States. And I'd like you to comment on fading interest in religion and possibly increasing in division, we'd say the Muslims, and maybe fundamentalism.
It opens up a whole slew of topics right here, some of which I probably would not want to get into today, like definition of religious fundamentalism, except as it pertains to relationship between church and state. So I'll try to restrict it to that. Yes, in many cases, people are abandoning their faith, even in the Nordic countries. A lot of the population does not attend church regularly. I've been to Lutheran churches up there to see what they were like, particularly in Finland. And church attendance is not that great. certainly not reflective of the population generally. They will come in there for things like Christmas and Easter and weddings and funerals and things like that, but they will not be regular church attenders. That doesn't seem to have affected anything as far as the state religion, being state religion is concerned. There's been no widespread movement to abandon that idea, not that I've been able to detect. Okay, I just want to add one more thing about religious fundamentalism. Religious fundamentalism is not at all loath to take strong positions on a whole raft of issues, including many of the ones I've described. And their attempt to influence public policy is often done through the ballot box. They will try to elect, particularly at the school board level, they'll try to elect school boards that will, for example, will allow the teaching of what they now call creation science in the schools. But when these have been challenged in court, virtually invariably they lose. So the courts have been one of the prime protectors of a religious imposition into things like the school system, which doesn't stop them from fighting. So another hand up.
I just want to say that I think all churches, or most churches and religions, are groups that have a certain set of beliefs. In other words, they believe what the world is, or they have a belief about what the world is, and they have also generally have beliefs about what the world should be. So, from that point of view, all churches, or most churches, are political in their nature, whether they're the kind that are pushing out their ideas constantly and standing on the street with pamphlets, or being quiet or being semi-noisy. They're all touting a particular set of beliefs about what is and what should be. So, what you can, and it's often done on. It's a case of the individual losing too, because it's done on behalf of the larger group. The United Church's ideas or the Catholic Church's ideas are promulgated as if everybody in those two disciplines agreed, and that's not so. So the individual does kind of get lost in the shuffle.
One of the comments you just made, I think, is particularly important, and that is that some churches tend to push forward their particular ideas as if they should apply to absolutely everyone. That means this poses a certain problem for them. They want to lobby. They want to lobby the government, for example. If you try to use religious language when you're lobbying government, you're not going to get very far. So they have to find more neutral language that would apply more broadly to society if they want to make a case for something. So that's a sort of a kind of self-imposed limitation on how far they can go and what language they're going to use to try to lobby government. Our own church has lobbied government in a number of areas, as you're well aware. Brian Kiley made a presentation to the Canadian Senate some years back on an issue, for example, and that's all reported in the Canadian Unitarian Council and so forth. So, yes, we do lobby ourselves, and every church does this to varying degrees, as you pointed out, some more noisily than others.
And it's not always satisfactory to the individual people. Some of the Unitarian church principles that they lobby about are either too broad or too restrictive or whatever from my point of view.
Right, okay, so what you're saying is that even if a position is being brought to government, someone's trying to lobby officially on behalf of their denomination, let's say,
Yeah.
then there are certain individuals within that denomination who may not agree with that policy. That's what you're saying, okay. Yeah, I think that's going to happen in any church, whether it's fundamentalist or not, but you're going to find that is the case, yes. It will not be representing them. Probably more likely to happen in the Unitarian church, given our diversity of beliefs, than in some others. So thank you for pointing that out. Someone else? Yes.
I have a question. It's nothing to do so much between church and state, but when actually did we have the first pope? First pope?
First pope?
Yes. And you mentioned also that there were a female hierarchy.
Judges.
Or judges.
And,
And so when did those first appear?
Well, we're probably talking about a period around 1000 BCE, and that's in
BC?
BC, yes.
Oh.
It's an old system that used to exist back then. But and there are some
The judges or BC?
the judges, yes, BCE. Okay. Oh, we're talking popes now. There are no female popes, but in the Old Testament, you have during the time when they didn't have kings, you had there's the book something called the Book of Judges. It's one of the books of the Old Testament, and some of those judges, not many, but a few of them, they've been female. Okay, but they were not kings. Okay, they exerted a certain leadership, perhaps through their force of character, their reputation, their abilities, and so forth. They acquired a certain reputation as leaders, maybe not elected leaders, maybe not formal leaders, but they did exercise some authority within their group in those days. And they performed a variety of functions, as I said. They weren't necessarily all judges, as we would understand the word. They were simply people who carried a certain kind of authority in certain areas, perhaps matching what the needs of the society were at that time.
When was the first Catholic pope?
The first pope, well, of course, the church contends that it was Peter was the first pope. But when it was recognized that the head of the Church of Rome was, in fact, the Pope, occurred sometime later, sometime well after the time of Peter. There was a period whereby the Pope, the head of the Church of Rome was recognized gradually, this was a gradual process, as a sort of preeminent bishop. The Eastern Church never accepted this. That's why one of the reasons they broke away. The Eastern Orthodox Church does not accept the authority of the Pope to speak for all Christians. That was one of the breaking points fairly early on. So I can't give you an actual year when it was established as a doctrine that the Pope has certain authorities. In fact, they were still adding to that doctrine as late as the mid-19th century. Well, that's when they declared the Pope was infallible in matters of faith and morals. But that's been a very late development.
Yeah, I'm concerned with the idea that something like polygamy, which is not accepted in Canada, but we can't manage to bring charges against somebody who has numerous wives. That we don't have the power to do that and bring them to court. And so, you know, how powerful what sort of controls do we have to impose what would be our rules and regulations? And apparently, someone who's Muslim, a Muslim fellow coming to Canada, if he has 2 wives, he's allowed to bring 2 wives to Canada. Why is that? Why is that allowed? And so I'm concerned that little things sneak in that are allowed, that gradually change. I mean, the idea of some Sharia laws coming in that are allowed when couples separate or something. Well, that's right, because they could do it by Sharia law. So, you know,
how do we control something like that?
These are major challenges,
Yeah.
but they are slightly different challenges. In the case of Mormonism, or old style Mormonism, where we have multiple wives, that issue has been, the prosecutors have been very reluctant to push that one because they do not want to see the Supreme Court of Canada declaring that it's legal. So they'd rather leave it ambiguous rather than taking a formal stance on that because they're afraid of losing the case. When they lose it, they don't lose it. So they're very hesitant to push too far towards that. So instead they go after other things, such as ill treatment of, such as marrying young women, young girls, for example. They'll go after those sorts of things. Right? Because there are laws on the books that clearly establish state supremacy in that area. So they'll go after that. Sending children out of the country to another community somewhere in the U.S. For these kinds of marriages is explicitly forbidden. Okay, so those kinds of cases they will prosecute, but not the general one, at least not yet. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops over time. Now, on some of the other ones, the Muslims are allowed to bring in up to 2 wives, not 5, like Muslim law says they can, but 2, they will allow that. It's one of those compromises that's been established. This is, I think they look at the situation where, okay, this has been a long-standing practice, a long-standing relationship. This guy has 2 wives. We're going to permit up to 2, but no more than 2.
It's economic because the person who can afford 2 wives is going to be richer and bring more money to the country and that's been part of the conservative policy in Canada to get more wealthy people to come in and bring their money.
That could have been another reason for that, but they felt that 3 may be pushing it. I mean, really rich to afford 3 wives.
Something and I'll cook.
Okay.
What about the push for Sharia law?
Push for Sharia law has so far not been successful in this country.
But little things creep in.
Little things may creep in. They may creep in at a local level or provincial level, but eventually.
Allow couples that are separating to do it through Sharia law because the Jewish people can do it.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I was going to mention that myself. Under Judaic law,
Yeah.
they have, the state has historically recognized, and I don't know many of the details on that area, frankly, but I do know that they do allow Jewish customs and Jewish law to basically to hold sway in certain circumstances. So why shouldn't that also apply to Muslims?
I've got a big concern about the dying with dignity law and all the fighting that's going on in court, the delays and all that. And I have heard by the grapevine that the Catholic Church is throwing huge amounts of money at it. Now, I can't quite figure out how money can buy you stuff about that subject, but maybe I'm missing something, and I'm upset. And I also found out that a lot of individual Catholics believe in dying with dignity, but would vote differently because the church tells them to. I find that absolutely insane, but there you go. So I wonder if you could just comment on this power struggle going on, or whatever the heck it is. Thank you.
Money can be used for lobbying purposes, and that usually costs money. If you want to hire a professional lobbying firm, for example, that's where the money would go. But again, the Catholic Church, like any other church in the country, is still subject to the same laws in terms of restrictions on how much actual political work they can do. Mind you, the Catholic Church is the largest Christian church in Canada, and as such commands a fairly large financial base. And 10% of a very large financial base is a lot of money. So that's probably how come they can still afford to do this and still stay within the law. As to following the dictates of the Pope, I'm not so sure that's as true as it once was of the official church. I know a lot of Catholics, my sister included, who are quite prepared to take issue with the church on social issues. And so I'm not sure how large a backing they would actually have. The church is no longer able to tell its parishioners like they used to back in Quebec especially, how to vote. Because these days, ever since voting became secret, they lost that power. And people will vote whichever way they choose to vote now. So I'm not sure that their control over their population is anywhere near as strong as it used to be. I'm sure some people would still follow it. Some of the more conservative Catholics would probably still follow that. But I'm not sure a lot of them would, or a huge number would. It's hard to tell.
Yeah, but it seems to be interfering with the court system right now.
Well, they may be trying to challenge the court system or to argue, what they're probably arguing is that the law as it was passed by Parliament should not be further liberalized. There are others lobbying on the other side, and eventually it's going to get sorted out in court, probably the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada has generally shown a very strong independent spirit, as the Conservatives have found out to their cost. So it was going to be very interesting. I see that's going to be a court battle coming up. And I don't think that the Catholic Church or any other conservative group is going to be able to buy a decision. I just simply don't see that happening.
Thank you.
That's my opinion. I will introduce the next topic under our church and state issue, and that is when it comes to particular elected representatives, should they be parking their religion at the door? This is a complex issue. We live in a diverse society with many different viewpoints, many different attitudes, many different religions in our country, and elected politicians are there to serve the entire country, not just a little segment of it. This can sometimes get them into hot water, as Pierre Trudeau found out when he was threatened with excommunication for his very liberal policies regarding sexual orientation and so forth. So it's not an easy issue to deal with. I'm going to read to you a quote. You may find of some interest. And then I'm going to ask you who said it. Third quotation. But what I am suggesting is this. Secularists are wrong when they ask believers to leave their religion at the door before entering into the public square. Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, William Jennings Bryan, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, indeed the majority of great reformers in American history, were not only motivated by faith, but repeatedly used religious language to argue for their cause. So to say that men and women should not inject their personal morality into public policy debates is a practical absurdity. Our law is by definition a codification of morality, much of it grounded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Who said that? Anybody want to take a guess? No? Barack Obama, when he was a senator. The direct quotation from a speech that he gave. So certainly in the States, there seems to be an expectation that you declare your religion if you're a candidate. It's not official anywhere, but there seems to be that general demand that people want to know what your religion is if they're going to elect you to office. You do not find that same pressure in this country, fortunately. But the issue is still there. If you're elected to office, there have been some Catholic priests who have been elected to office. Before that, the church, I think, finally banned that. I guess they're afraid to make too many compromises. But the issue of should you, if you're a practicing person in a particular religion, what do you do about that if you're going to be elected to office? How do you handle that? Certainly the penalties of going too far against what the church expects of you as an individual can be fairly severe. So let me ask you the question. Is it legitimate to expect our elected representatives to leave their religion at the door when they are elected to office, particularly when they are faced with a party platform that in some respects may be at variance with their own religious values.
I would think that the politicians and the congregation need to remember what their creed is or their principles are, what the American Constitution believes in, and not cross it. Whatever the religion says, as long as it's in line with the Constitution or our principles or a church's creed, or no. We're talking politics. The country's constitution, what we stand for, then it can be allowed, I presume. But that has to be the guiding principle.
The only problem with that is when the guiding principles are not explicit on a particular issue.
General, and they're very general.
Yeah, my principles are general, but they have to be because they have to cover so many circumstances.
I think they should leave it at the door when they leave wherever they are, their house, their church, or whatever. Try to be objective and try to be secularist rather than careless, or as Stephen Harper did, secretly using his church affiliation without ever mentioning anything, but using his affiliation to cause certain laws to come into being. And I think that's bad.
Haven't we had some cases recently where people will abstain from voting because of their religion gets in the way and they have to stand hold back? And then if you leave the religion at the door, you still bring your morals and ethics in with you. And that's how government has to run as well.
So you'd be inclined to agree with Barack Obama that it's impractical to expect that people are going to do that. Okay? Whereas you're not so.
There's a.
But you take not
I agree with her. The point is, in the American context, for example, there's a lot made of the whole business of the fundamental Christian group being catered to, and certain politicians having to be having to be believers in fundamental beliefs and that kind of thing. It's very interesting, though, that in the current run-up for the president, none of the people seem to be overtly religious and so on. And in the original U.S. Constitution, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were both sort of clockwork deists. And they both contributed to the money, to the building of churches in Boston and elsewhere. So it's sort of interesting that, there isn't as much of a history in the U.S. as they like to believe.
Other opinions? What about lobbying? Is it legitimate for us to be lobbying for our causes? Are there restrictions we should impose ourselves? Any ideas on that? Now, when you see other churches intensively lobbying their representatives, either provincially or federally, and you don't agree with the positions that these groups are taking, you feel that they should be limited in some way in their ability to influence government. No opinions on that?
Well, there's nothing keeping the alternatives from lobbying.
There's nothing to keep the alternatives from lobbying, that's true, except maybe money. Yes. Okay, so certainly, as I said, we and every other church I know of who takes a strong position on any issue of their own are quite prepared to speak out about it. And we do attempt to influence public policy. And it doesn't matter whether you're a conservative or a liberal group, you will still make that attempt. And I think, generally speaking, in our society, this is viewed as legitimate. Okay. Which doesn't make, still leaves the issue, if you are the elected representatives, and you feel yourself strong on a given issue, on the issue of doctors' suicide, there have been members of the Liberal Party, which, as you know, was really pushing for this officially, who were not comfortable with that position. So when you're in that situation, what do you do as an elected representative? Your party expects you're going to vote a certain way. You were elected as a member of that party. What is your civil obligation? Is it to follow your leader? Is it to follow the party? Is it to follow the dictates of your own conscience? How do you decide?
Can you ask the people who voted for you what their opinion is?
You can ask the people who voted for you, and many
Some do.
many people do that, do exactly that. They will hold forums at the writing level and say, okay, well, how do you feel about this? And they'll say, well, I'm here to represent my constituents.
Yeah.
And my constituents feel strongly on this side of an issue, then that's the way I should vote. That many Canadians would agree that this is a proper way for them to do. Others might argue that, no, if I'm elected as a member of a political party on a certain platform, the expectation is I will follow the dictates of that party. And that's as it should be, in their opinion. So you will get a variety of opinions as to what exactly who they should follow. Or maybe their own conscience may dictate that, okay, I know what my constituents feel, I know what my party says, but this is what I believe personally, and I feel very strongly on this. Now what they might do is to argue for a free vote. In other words, vote your conscience. This is what happened with the death penalty when it was finally abolished. Vote your conscience. There was a free vote in Parliament. That's one way to handle that issue. Okay, so again, it's a challenging issue if you are elected to Parliament or to a provincial legislature. Any further thoughts on that? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your participation today. I think we've heard a variety of viewpoints on some of these issues. They are complex issues. They're not easily resolved, and certainly they will continue to arise as time goes along. In our own muddling Canadian way, we will find ways of compromising here and there to allow certain things to happen and keep everybody at least somewhat satisfied in the process. Not everyone, but at least enough to continue to carry on. And that's been the way we normally do things in this country. And so it shall continue.